Today we're installing the built engine into our Corolla and discovering a pretty big problem we've got with the build. This is my 1979 Toyota Corolla. It already has a 3RZ swapped into it. This is out of a Tacoma. It's got a 700 horsepower fuel system in it. It will need injectors. And it is pretty well bone stock. It's got a set of cheap headers on it, but that doesn't really do much for power. Other than that, there's been nothing done to this engine. It has an unknown number of miles. I bought it from a rolled truck that had no odometer, and it's really done fine. There are no issues with this engine. I could throw boost at this engine, but my power goals are pretty darn high, and these rods tend to fold in half. That's why I built this engine. It's got a quality set of rods in it, and it's been completely and totally gone through. New bearings, new rings, honed, head surfaced, the deck of the block has been surfaced, MLS gasket, ARP head studs, pretty much everything I need to be able to push 500 plus wheel horsepower out of it. Before we can get a built engine in here, we got to get this engine out of here. So we're going to be ripping this thing apart. This is still a good engine. There's nothing wrong with it at all. So I'm going to pull it, set it aside, and use it for another project at a later date. The reason I'm putting a built engine in instead of just boosting the engine that's in there is because this is a 2RZ, that is a 3RZ. This is a 2.4, that's a 2.7. Doesn't sound like a big deal. They are the same engine management, same everything, but this is over half of an inch shorter. And I plan on building a turbo manifold. And if I'm building a turbo manifold specific to this chassis, specific to this engine, I'd like it to be at the final height. So, since I am going to be putting a different engine in here, I want to have that in before I start boosting it. Then I will be building a turbo manifold. I've got a bunch of goodies here, I've got a turbo over here, and I will be putting all of that onto the Corolla. Well, we're in the midst of getting everything swapped over to the built 2RZ from the 3RZ to get into the Corolla, and I found some not so ideal news. So, pulled the oil pan off because obviously it's a very custom oil pan and I'm going to need that in order to get it to fit in the Corolla, and this engine was knocking. There is no movement in the bearings, but there is very much so metal in this oil pan. And I pulled a bearing cap off, and I actually ended up pulling all 4 bearing caps off. All 4 rod bearings are real marred up. Don't know exactly what happened there. I don't know if it's... I did do quite a few donuts in this thing, so I don't know if the G-forces pulled the oil away from the pickup tube, or if... I just don't know what's going on exactly. So I went ahead and I got my sandwich plate, and I'm going to put a manual oil pressure gauge on this engine when I put it back in. That way, if there are any oil pressure issues, we can immediately shut it down and hopefully save this engine from any major damage. Got a lot of time and money in this engine, and I really don't want to knock it for no reason. So we're going to do everything we can to be diligent and make sure this thing has good oil pressure at all times, and hope, pretty much. That's all I can do. I don't know if this engine was already going on its way out. I didn't inspect the bearings before I put that oil pan on or when I put this in the Corolla. In fact, I kind of hate to admit it, but I never even changed the oil in this thing. I don't use Fram oil filters, and this had a Fram oil filter. And I know that the truck this came out of was very rolled, spent some time upside down. So I don't know if there was already some damage done and metal in the oil and it just kept going through and destroying the bearings, or if it had oil pressure starvation at any point. I know that these are some pretty crazy angles for the oil to be going up, but also this is factory pickup tube that is just shortened. I don't know exactly what happened, but I do know that this has some pretty bad bearings, and this one has brand new bearings, and I really don't want to have anything happen to them. So I'm gonna clean that oil pan out. We're gonna finish getting everything swapped over to get the 2RZ into the Corolla, and we're gonna pay a lot of attention to this thing when we get it put back together and make sure it's always got good oil pressure. That's about all I can do. If there's ever any oil pressure issues, I pull the engine out. I can remake the oil pan, do something like that, but for now, I'm just gonna throw it in there and see if we can get it together and then get this broken in and not broken. With that, we've got our engine completely together. We've got the clutch on it. I've got motor mounts, random coolant lines, injectors, proper fuel rail, oil filter sandwich plate, so we can put a manual oil pressure gauge on this thing, because currently there is no oil pressure gauge in the Corolla, which is what I believe led to all of these bearings looking like that. They're far from the worst, but all of them are scarred up. Luckily, the crankshaft looks fabulous on all 4 journals. So I think we got lucky, pulled it apart. There was actually no play in any of the bearings. I just noticed the material in the oil pan and decided to pull it apart. So I think we got lucky on this one, but this engine is going to need, at the very least, new bearings. Glad I got that pulled out when I did, because if we would have waited much longer, there's a good chance it would have scarred up the crankshaft, and this engine is so incredibly clean on the inside. I have pulled apart a lot of 3RZs. That one has one of the cleanest inside of engines I've ever seen. Let's get to throwing this in the Corolla so we can get it fired up for the first time and break in our new engine. Well, there's like 2 differences to the outside of the block of a 2RZ versus a 3RZ. One, a little bit shorter on the 2RZ, 3/4 of an inch according to my tape measure when I had both these engines out. 2, the oil filter mounts so slightly different. This one has this long drop down, I assume to accommodate the 2-wheel drive suspension. And the 3RZ has this, which holds the filter. The mount point is well above the motor mount point. And on the 2RZ, this is just about the same as the motor mount plate. And those 2 inches are enough that this won't go on. So I think I'm gonna see if I can pull this off and rotate it. I don't know. I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm very sad about that. This oil filter adapter housing just bolts in, and that secondary bolt is just to hold it additionally. So, since I want to get this thing running, and I'm probably gonna end up ordering an adapter plate to relocate the oil filter to somewhere else because it's just not gonna fit, I'm gonna just turn that a little bit, tighten it down, and an oil filter should fit, ideally. We'll find out. But I'm gonna try that for sure. Engine's in, everything's hooked up. The only thing that is not on right now is the rest of the intake and the exhaust. The rest of the intake's not on, and that's because I want to get an oil pressure gauge on here. So I'm gonna have to route an oil pressure line around the exhaust, and it'd be easier with the intake out of the way. And the rest of the exhaust is not on because I'm adding a muffler to this thing. I don't care if it's the lowest hanging thing on the car. I don't care if it's ugly. I don't care if it's not permanent. this thing's getting a muffler. I cannot do the super loud exhaust anymore, and I've got a feeling that I would have been able to better assess what was going on with that engine had the exhaust not been rattling my eardrums. So we're cutting up that exhaust and figuring a way to get a muffler on it. Some sort of muffler, some sort of way. Can't do it anymore. We've got everything wrapped up, intake on, exhaust on. I built a whole new exhaust that has a muffler on it. It's not necessarily the most ideal exhaust, but it's gotta be quieter than it was. And filled it with oil, should be good to go. I need to throw some water in the radiator and install the oil pressure gauge. This will tell us if we're doing any damage to the engine when we first start it up. But that's all I really have to do, so I'm gonna jump on that, get the last few things buttoned up, crank it over till it builds oil pressure, and then hopefully we get to start this thing tonight. I would be lying if I said I was not nervous. We've got water in it, we've got oil in it, we're about to hook up a battery, and then see how things go. Right now my thought is I'm gonna pull the fuel pump fuse and crank it over till I see fuel pressure, and then go from there. So that's step one. All right. Oil pressure gauge, just temporarily mounted. No fuel pump. Well, that's a bit of cranking with no oil pressure. Starting to make me nervous. That's a lot of cranking with no oil pressure. Oh, no leaks or anything. So I guess we'll try again. Oh, anxiety. Plug the fuel pump in. No issues there. I don't know why it has no oil pressure yet. I don't know if it's just the pump not being primed. It's a lot of cranking. Now it even fired up. Oh, thank goodness. Oh, I feel so much better. Almost 70 pounds of oil pressure. I was getting nervous. And I can hear myself think over this thing. I think I put the wrong mass airflow sensor in here because it doesn't want to stay running. So I'm going to swap that out real quick. Do a once over for leaks. But I think that was a first fire on my built engine and it's not doing anything crazy yet. New mass airflow sensor. Oh, let's hope this time it stays running. All right, I've got one more mass airflow sensor to try because there were 3 and I just set them all next to each other like a genius. Oh, it fires up. Final mass airflow sensor I have inside, otherwise I'd have to go pull it off another car. It's idling. It was idling. Oh my goodness. I think all of these mass airflow sensors are giving me some hassle. I might have a loose ground somewhere. I don't know. This valve train doesn't sound loud. There sounds like there's no weird ticks or tonks or clanks. I think we built an engine for our Corolla. God, that feels good. No oil leaks. All right, we've been running for a minute. I had to open the garage door. My eyes burn. Trying to get it up to temp. So glad this thing is quieter. I can hear myself think and it's running. Upper radiator hose is warm. Lower radiator hose is not. Just gonna let it idle here for a second and step outside where I can breathe. I'll bet I know why this thing runs like crap. That's a very important sensor back there. Oh, it's hot as hell now. Woo. Yeah, it's got no coolant temp sensor going to the engine, so that's why it run like crap. The ECU does not know how to fuel it. Dummy. I feel dumb about that. Surprised it's running as well as it is. Still have oil pressure. Down to 25 PSI. I'm not exactly sure what spec is for this engine, but 25 is not bad for an idle that sounds about like 800 or so. Yeah! I want to do donuts now, but I'm pretty sure that's what knocked the first engine, is oil sloshing and all the not good things. Party in the house tonight. Oh. Lower radiator hose is getting warm. I think we're about up to temp. Running a lot better now that it's up to temp. I think I'm gonna call that. I'm gonna turn it off. We'll do another heat cycle in the morning. Maybe take it for a little drive. See how it does with oil pressure moving. But 25 PSI is a solid base number for idle. Whew. Now I gotta get out of this garage so I can not die of carbon monoxide poisoning. Last night we got the first heat cycle in this engine. It started up, it ran, it had good oil pressure. And this morning we're gonna go take it for a cruise, see how it feels, put it under some load, break the rings in properly, and just make sure everything is good to go and up to par. But first we're gonna make sure it's got plenty of water in it, make sure it's got plenty of oil in it. I plugged in the coolant temperature sensor in the back of the head because that's important for the ECU to understand how much fuel to give this thing. I think that's why it was running like such crap last night. So all these things should help a ton. Not much to it but to do it. As soon as the engine's broken in, we can start thinking about getting our Fueltech engine management on here, which would be awesome. That'll absolutely transform the way this thing runs. Okay. Oh, this is so much more bearable in terms of noise. Got 75 PSI of oil pressure right now. Okay. That's not good. Oil pressure drops when I take off real hard. I think I'm gonna start by overfilling the engine with a little bit of oil. What the fuck? Oil pressure is all over the place. Yeah, left-hand turns. Does not like left-hand turns. Right-hand turns are fine. Okay. I need more baffling in my oil pan, it seems like. Or something. Long sweeping right. It's fine. Yep, right-hand turns are fine. Left-hand turns are not fine. I'm going to start by adding an extra quart of oil to the pan and see if that helps. I just did a super tight donut to the right and there were no issues, but even like a slight turn to the left and the oil pressure has a slight dip. So, it's good to know. Sad I didn't have an oil pressure gauge on here before. I could have figured that out. It never lost oil pressure. It would just go from like 50 down to 25 at a slightly higher RPM. Cool. So there are a few different things I could do to combat this oil pressure issue. The most logical and the smartest thing I could do would be to pull this oil pan and rebuild it and or add baffling so that there's no issues with corners. But what I'm going to start with is the easiest solution, and I'm just going to add a quart and a half or so of oil. I'm going to see if maybe this pan, just the way it's built, being really wide, being really shallow but really wide, an extra quart of oil might just resolve our issues. So I'm going to start by doing that. It currently reads full on the dipstick. It reads right at the full line. So it's going to read a little bit over full, but I think that's better than no oil pressure. I'd rather have some oil slosh than low oil pressure. Add a little bit of oil. We're now over full. Let's see if that solved any of our problems. I would be slightly worried about overfilling this thing, but the turbo truck and its custom oil pan, I've had that thing over full according to the dipstick since I built it. So 10,000 miles on that, no engine issues in 10,000 miles of hard use. I'm going to hope and assume that this thing will benefit and not have any issues with a little bit extra oil. I haven't been nervous to drive this thing in a minute, but since this oil pressure issue, I've been nervous. I don't want to have oil pressure issues on an engine that I just built and has 2 miles on it. First, sweeping left turn. No! Aww. People suck. They definitely didn't have to hit that guy. About to turn left into a parking lot. No crazy oil pressure drop. That's a start. Now we got to get some gas. While we're here in this parking lot, I'm going to go ahead and do a couple circles in each direction. starting with the left-hand turn because that's what was giving us issues. Woo! Yep, that was scary. Once I got a little bit hard on the left, it cut oil pressure. Oh. I mean, you can always add a little bit more oil. All the other fixes I know of are going to be expensive and hard to do. Oh yeah. See, to the left it cuts out. Go to the right. That's just fine to the right. Well, I guess we're gonna have to pull this oil pan or get an AccuSum or I don't know, I might overfill it a little more and see if that resolves the issue. I really don't want to pull this oil pan right now. Mainly I just don't want to pull this engine. I have a ton of work I need to do to this thing, and pulling the engine's gonna be rather cumbersome. So